So Dan had asked me to talk in general about starch digestion, and it's for those of you that have been working in this area for a while know that it's a pretty difficult area to talk about because there's so many things that are involved in metabolism of starch in ruminant animals. So I'm going to try to do my best to give you a little background of digestibility, where starch is metabolized, and talk a little bit about factors that affect the metabolism and digestibility of starch, and anywhere from processing to particle size to endosperm, etc. Okay? So here are the topics of discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about metabolism of starch, where it happens, why it's important. We're also going to spend a lot of time talking about the factors that affect starch digestion, including, as I had mentioned earlier, the physical pericarp, differences in endosperm, effects of maturity, and prolamin proteins, and also talk a bit about how length of ensiling can affect the availability of starch as well. So, we know if we start off with starch digestion and talk about what happens, at least from the plant standpoint, and take the corn plant as our model, we know that what happens is that as the plant matures, it's basically converting sugars in the kernels to starch. And why Mother Nature is doing this is because starch is a good energy source for the plant embryo. So you have to think about every corn kernel is a baby to the plant, and that baby needs this energy in order to germinate and grow. And unfortunately, sugars and water are not a very stable product, whereas starch is much more stable. And so the plant is converting these sugars and waters into starch as that primary energy source for the embryo. And of course, starch is a very rich source of energy that's fermentable in the rumen and digestible in the small intestine, also fermentable in the hindgut as well. And we all know that, relative to digestible fiber, that starch, by weight provides, 2 to 3 times more energy, digestible energy anyway, than fiber is. And so it is a really good source of nutrients for high producing lactating dairy cows. Just chemically, it's kind of interesting to remember that if you look at the monomer units of our main carbohydrate sources, which would be something like cellulose here on the right versus starch, that they're all based on glucose. And it's really the bonding between the glucose units that make these two carbohydrate sources so different in their availability for fermentation and digestibility. You can see that in this projection here, cellulose is usually long chains of glucose, and they're usually in what we call beta 1,4 links here, whereas starch is more globular and has a lot of branching in it, and the glucose is linked by what we call alpha 1,4 links. And if you don't know this, it's the beta 1,4 link between glucose molecules and cellulose that basically is not digestible by mammalian or animal enzyme systems, and it's only microbial systems pretty much that can break that beta 1,4 link. But again, it's really a metabolic marvel when you think about the fact that these two types of carbohydrates are so different in nature, but yet they're comprised of the same monomer unit, and it's just because of the linking primarily that makes one very digestible versus making one not very digestible. And of course, we all know that there are these really nice relationships between starch digestibility and production. I borrowed this graph from Randy Shaver and Luis Ferretto. They had a publication in JDS in 2013 where they did the correlation of ruminal starch digestibility as a % of intake here, and regressed this on adjusted total tract digestibility as a % of intake. And you can see there's a really highly correlated P.04 relationship between these two. And if you take that one step further and you look at total tract starch digestibility and adjusted milk yield here, sorry, this is in kilograms. This is a slide that's updated from some earlier work that Jeff Firkins had done, where his milk yields were actually quite a bit lower than in this database. But as you can see in this line, if you look at total starch digestibility as a percent of intake in cows, if you're going from about 78 to 80%, if you increase that to about 98%, the difference there, if you take this here intersect, which is about 34, and this intersect here, which is about 36, is about 2 kilos of milk, or 4.4 pounds of milk. So if we can get starch digestibility in the tract of a cow to be upper towards this 97, 98%, if we happen to be down here for some reason and we could fix that, we would gain something like about 4.4 pounds of milk, going from 80 to 98% starch digestion. So really nice, again, highly correlated P.04 value as well here. So this is one of our reasons why we look at starch as being an important component in our dairy diets. If you kind of take a look at the potential sites of digestion in a lactating cow, I kind of have them broken down here. At the top, I have a digestion, sorry, double of, but digestion of total starch. 55 to 85% of what comes into the mouth of the cow has the potential to be fermented in the rumen. 10 to 35% coming in from the diet maybe goes into the small intestine. And typically we would probably want to see less than 5% of starch digestion in the hind gut. But these are all three of these sites have the potential to either ferment starch here and here, or actually digest it here in the small intestine. Now, obviously, what happens in the rumen is that when starch is fermented, there's production of what I call VFAs, or the volatile fatty acids. For the most part, in general, primarily, you're going to get production of propionic acid from the fermentation of starch in the rumen. But along with that production of propionic acid, we also end up with production of microbial crude protein, of which the cow is getting amino acids from once that microbial protein hits the small intestine. So this is the good part about starch fermentation: production of energy to make propionate. Propionate is absorbed by the cow, goes to the liver then converts it to glucose, and the cow then will use that glucose to make lactose, which then will drive milk production volume. So we've got production of energy, production of what I consider free microbial protein that we don't have to put in from the diet. So that's a really good thing. And then the problem with fermentation in the rumen, however, is that there's always got to be a balance. And it could be, if we have too much starch digestion in the rumen, or it's too much too quickly, we possibly could end up with excessive fermentations, which may lead to acidosis. In the small intestine, any starch that is accessible by the cow's enzymes, the cow's amylase enzymes there, that would be absorbed directly as glucose and used by the cow as glucose, again, going to lactose, driving milk production. But there is the potential for the capacity of the small intestine to actually digest all of the starch that gets there, if in fact too much gets there. And so that's the pros and the cons there. In the hindgut, we have a situation where certainly anything that is available for fermentation or digestion that misses those processes in the rumen or the small intestine, if they get to the hindgut, the hindgut gets a second shot at fermentation. It'll make volatile fatty acids, make propionate, make glucose in the liver and be absorbed. But what we miss in the hindgut is any microbial protein that's made there is not utilized. And there is, in fact, a lot of evidence lately coming from many different groups, Keys Plazier's group in Canada, for example, to name one of them, that suggests that there is the possibility that you could actually have excessive hindgut fermentation occurring if something's out of sync in the small intestine and the rumen, and that this possibly could lead to hindgut acidosis and possibly lead to other secondary Clostridial infections, et cetera. So our real goal, I think, if you look at the metabolism of starch in the lactating cow, is to really try to maximize the fermentation of incoming starch in the rumen to maximize VFA and microbial protein production, and trying to minimize what reaches the hindgut so that we don't end up with this excessive hindgut type of acidosis. Okay. Here's some recommended carbohydrate levels on a dry matter basis in a diet. I know there's a lot of numbers here, but as we talk about starch through this presentation, and when you look at other presentations by other people, people are talking about starch in the diet, but they're also talking about fermentable starch. With people talking about fermentable carbohydrates. And so these are just some numbers taken from an article by Charlie and in Hordes Dairyman in 2011, looking at different groups of cows here, fermentable total carbohydrates, fermentable starch, sugars, and fermentable soluble fiber. And I guess I'm going to try to draw your attention here, since we're talking about starch, primarily to this column here, where we're seeing ranges anywhere, at least for lactating cows, anywhere between probably 17 to 23% fermentable starch coming into the diet as an optimum. For total starch and sugars in the diet, you know, most people, if you look at the Cornell model and some of the other work that Glenn Broderick has done in the past, we see probably people coming down to some kind of agreement that total free sugars are going to be someplace in that 5 to 7% free sugar range, 22 to 25% starch coming in, with a total of 31% sugars and starch, but maybe having somewhere between 16 and 18% rumen fermentable starch coming into the diet. And of course, these numbers are not hard and fast. There's obviously some wiggle room around these, depending on what are the types of things you're feeding. So these are not etched in stone, but it gives you kind of an idea of where we kind of want to be. And certainly, you know, historically, if you look at, you know, 5-10 years ago, where we had a lot of starch diets as high as 32% of the dry matter being starch in some of our TMRs, and you can easily find that if you go to, you know, the Journal of Dairy Science, for example, and look at some of these really high starch diets that were fed. But I think with our understanding of fermentability, physically effective NDF, rates of digestion, we've really been able to lower the starch content into our diets. And more recently, you know, I typically see a lot of diets down in the 22-24% starch range. At least that's pretty much where my herd is at the university. We have a really small herd at UD. We milk only about 100 cows, but we've been down at the 22-23% starch range for probably the last 5-6 years, and have been doing quite well on that. So things have changed because of our understanding of again, staying out of acidosis and physically effective fiber. And of course, just to kind of show you a kind of a real world example, this was a study that we ran several years ago, where we had what I would consider, you know, moderately low starch diets, 22-23% starch of the dry matter, but with highly digestible fiber, and still we're able to maintain, you know, quite high levels of production. I'm sorry, this is not kilos. Sorry, folks. This is actually pounds. But you can see in this study, these cows were producing between 105 and 112 pounds a day, and on a 22% starch diet with pretty high corn silage in them. This happened to be 35% of the dry matter is normal corn silage. This was 35% BMR corn silage of the dry matter. This was 50% of the dry matter of the TMR as BMR silage. And yet we were able to maintain quite high levels of production. And these levels of production that you're seeing here are the average for cows between that started at about 95 days in milk and ended the study at 200 days in milk. So the values that you see here are the average between 90 and 200 days in milk, and they're quite good, I think. And you'll see when you looked at total tract digestibility, so actually taking fecal samples from these cows, you can see we have quite high organic matter digestibilities. NDF digestibility significantly higher with the BMRs, as you would expect, and starch digestibilities for the whole tract, all above, around 98% or higher, which is pretty much where people would like to see your diets at. Now, having shown you that there's obviously a good thing with these starch diets and that we can drive milk production here, we need to talk about what are the factors that potentially affect this starch digestion. And I've listed 4 of them here, the most obvious ones. The first would be the outer protection from the bran or the pericarp, because if the rumen bacteria or cow's enzymes cannot actually get in and attach and colonize the surface area of the starch granules, we're not going to get fermentation or enzymatic digestion occurring. Once that has happened, however, the next limiting factor is probably surface area or particle size. And so things like gelatinization, which causes expansion of the starch, grinding, steam flaking, all these types of things obviously will increase surface area for bacterial and enzymatic attachment. And then the type of endosperm or the vitreousness then can also affect the availability of starch, as can the length of ensiling. And we'll talk about pretty much each of these in a second. So first, starch has to be accessible, as I said, and the pericarp here is surrounding the endosperm and the germ where most of the starch is and the protein matrix. And so if we can't break through this, we're not going to be able to get our bugs and our enzymes there. So first things first, break that pericarp down so we can access the starch. Next, particle size. This is some data from Pat Hoffman. The blue line here, if you can see it at the bottom, is showing high prolamin in dry corn, and then high moisture corn up here having a low prolamin content, and looking at in vitro total starch digestibility here, high to low, and the mean particle size. And you can see that regardless of whether you're in dry corn or high moisture corn, as you decrease the particle size going this way, you're increasing the in vivo total tract starch digestibility. So that's pretty much particle size, increased surface area, and higher digestibility. But within this, you can see that a high prolamin sample is going to increase at a slower rate here than the low prolamin. And so obviously those prolamin proteins are also now confounding this effect of what you see with particle size. And this happens to be some pictures of raw unheated starch granules here, 70% heated with water, so we've got some gelatinization occurring, and then something that was actually imploded at 90 degrees C. And I think it's pretty obvious that what you can see that even without particle size grinding differences, this gelatinization and heat with moisture product is actually improving and increasing the surface area that's available for attachment by rumen bacteria and or the cow's enzymes. Now, once we get past the pericarp and we get down to grinding of corn, of course, with corn silage, the big thing is corn silage processing score. And so one of the things that we have to deal with is that kernels of corn in our corn silage, if they're not cracked and crushed adequately enough, we're not going to get good digestibility. So the CPS, the CSPS score, excuse me, which was developed by Mertens at the Forage Lab, basically gives you a ranking of optimum, average, or inadequately processed corn silage. And basically what they do, folks, is they'll take a sample of your corn silage, send it to the lab, they'll dry it down, they'll put it through a bunch of shakers, and what they're looking for is the percent of starch passing through a screen that has 4.75 millimeter diameter squares in it. And I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in a second. What they will do then is do a starch analysis on the material that's passing through the screen and that's retained above the screen. If you have a sample of corn silage that has been determined to have more than 70% of the total starch in the sample go through the 4.75 millimeter screen, it will give you a rank of optimum. Between 50 and 70 is average. Less than 50 is inadequately processed. This is some older data, and there's been lots of newer updates on what the industry looks like right now. But you can see that in this older database, only 7% of the CVAS samples were optimum, only 51 were average, and 42 were inadequately processed. I believe if you look at the data today, you would see these numbers greatly improved, and probably we're seeing numbers up here in the 15 to 20%, here probably 40 to 50 to 60%, and the inadequately processed numbers now coming in from a number of labs. And I've seen recent data from Rock River and Dairyland and Cumberland. This number is probably down more into the 15 to 20% range over the last probably 5 or 6 years. So the industry has really appears to have improved a lot. Although I'm going to tell you that you need to take those kinds of numbers with a little bit of grain of salt, because I think what we see in the numbers changing is also part of a function of the fact of who is actually sending the samples in, right? Because they're not totally random samples that are sent in to do a corn silage processing score. I would say that most people, if they're going to send a sample in, it's because they are looking to see if there really is an issue or not. And so the numbers that we see coming out of the labs, I think, have been chosen by nutritionists across the U.S. And so take those numbers with a little bit with a grain of salt when you see the distribution. This was an early study that we had done several years ago. Now it's almost 12 years ago, where we happened to have a BMR corn silage and unprocessed and processed, and everything was completely the same in the diet. Same forage concentrate ratio. The BMR was just from the same field. Just part of it was unprocessed and part of it was processed. And you can see the difference in intake and milk production from these cows just with processing, the difference that processing made. Unfortunately, we didn't have a corn silage processing score back then when we did this study, because we actually did this study probably back in 2001 or 2 when it was actually done. But it was very obvious when we screened the manure that you could see, many whole kernels, half kernels in the unprocessed material, and very few here. And again, we're just increasing the surface area to make better use of that starch. Borrowed this from Randy Shaver. He's actually putting a value on what excellent processing is worth. I will tell you that what you see here, the relationship is probably not linear. So that's an important thing. But for someone asking the question, what is it worth for me if my processing score is at 50% today, and I work with either my custom chopper or I readjust my rollers such that I can get to something from 50 to 60 on the processing score, what would that be worth? Randy basically is saying that that's probably worth about 2 pounds of milk. And then if you take that one step further, what would it get me if I was at 60, but I could get it to 70? So I'm at the middle of adequate going to excellent. That also could be another 2 pounds of milk for you. Now, like I say, the issue here is that this is not linear. So, you know, if someone said, I'm at 68, is it worth me going to 72? I don't think anybody could give you a good answer to that. But on a broader scale, certainly what Randy is saying here, if you went from 50 to 70, you'd probably get 3 to 4 pounds of milk here with that big of a difference. And you know, you can do the math. Even if it was only 2 pounds from going to 50 to 70, if you had a ton of silage and you were feeding, you know, 25 cows or something that ton was going to into the TMRs, and you got 2 pounds per milk per cow, and maybe you had to pay $1 or $2 more per ton to go from a 50 to 70, do the calculation and see if that's worth it. And I think you'll find that it's pretty much a no-brainer. I think I like to use this graph, which is actually pretty old. And this is another slide that I've borrowed from Randy because I love this slide, because what it basically shows you is whole plant dry matter here going from 30 to 45. So the plant's maturing. There's a bigger prolamin matrix being laid down, and then total starch digestion in the cow. And, you know, earlier I had suggested that our goal needs to be someplace up here, that 97, 98% starch digestion. So that's where it's here. And the important thing that I like to point out on this slide is two things. You can see that what happens in total starch digestion in the track, that in unprocessed corn silage, it actually declines quite rapidly when we get up to the black layer level right here. So our potential total tract digestion of starch declines if we get corn silage that is too mature. You can see that if you take those same plants, but the one thing that you want to see here is that, look at this. If I consciously made the decision to harvest my corn silage at a very high dry matter, very high maturity, and I processed it, okay, it's going to give me still a lower starch digestibility than if I had something that was immature and unprocessed, okay? Now, the thing that you have to, the caveat here is obviously is that there can be quite a big gain in total starch content of the plant going from 30 to about 40 or 42%. But what you have to do then is kind of look at the compromise of where you want to be, but not say that I can get away with very mature corn silage because I'm going to process it, because processing isn't going to really get you back up into this level when you're really, really way out here. Now, this slide is pretty dated, and the rate of decline that you see in this slide here might actually be a little different today. I'm not sure, because of coming in to readjust the processing slide to see if this might be tempered a little bit today. Okay, so one of the issues that we have with the corn silage processing score is that, you know, pretty much the fastest you could get a sample back would probably be within the next day or 24-hour period, right? You've got to send it to the lab. I know the labs during corn silage season have expedited CSPS analysis for you, where if you get something into them, you know, in the afternoon, in the morning, they could probably get you a score by the next afternoon, within the next day. But it's still is a slow process. I mean, within a day, you might be in the next field and you might not know whether you were processed well enough. So there are some thumb rules that you can use to assess the degree of processing. They're certainly not as accurate as the CSPS, but they are good thumb rules to use, lacking any other type of on-farm tool. And one of the recommendations that has been out for many years is that you probably want to see 90 to 95% of your kernels cracked or crushed. And my caveat to all of this is to add in that probably 70% or more of these kernels should be smaller than a third to a quarter size of a kernel. And the reason that I put that in there is because this, folks, here is the size of a 4.75 millimeter screen, okay? And so if you see that the screen on the CSPS unit, that's gonna determine whether these kernels of corn go through or stay above, they've gotta go through this hole to get through there. And if you look at this picture here, I would probably say that almost none of these kernels here are probably gonna make it through that square. Would you kind of agree?
Yeah.
So that means that if you look at all of these kernels of corn here, if this was your sample that you sent in, this sample would not be adequately processed. And so this means that nicking and crushing are probably not enough, okay? And that's kind of sobering to me when I look at the size of a diameter of a 4.75 millimeter screen, and the screens that these things go through are square, they're not holes, but they're 4.7 millimeter diameter holes. And here's a ruler, and you can see how big these kernels are. All right. Now, another thing that you could do is the bucket of water test. We've done this for years and years and years. You can see this is a really old picture, 2001 from our farm. But what we will do is take a 20-liter bucket of water. You can do this with a smaller pail too, but I like to use a bigger bucket of water. Fill it full of water. Get a couple handfuls of freshly chopped forage coming from the chopper. Throw them into the bucket. Swirl them around very slowly for 5 or 10 seconds. Let it settle out a little bit. What'll happen in fresh material is all of this, all of the husks, the cobs, the shank, the leaves will basically float, and all of the corn kernels will basically fall to the bottom. Now, it's not a perfect test because there's a lot of fine particles that can occur here. But once you have this kind of washed out in your bucket for a few seconds, what you can do is use your hand and physically remove as much of this floating material that you see here that's floating on the top of the bucket in a mat. Use your hand to take out as much of that you can, and then slowly pour the water out, helping the rest of the material that's floating off of, so that it leaves the bucket. And you probably want to do it very carefully at the end so that you don't have any of the corn kernels to go out. You can fill up the bucket probably once or twice with water, and again, help the floating material out. By about the third wash, you're going to end up with this at the bottom of your bucket. And then it's a judgment call, folks, okay? So again, it's not perfect. It is a judgment call, but you're going to have to kind of look at this sample and say, do I believe that probably 70% of these samples of this corn here would, about 70% of that probably get through that 4.75 millimeter square. So, you know, obviously this particle, this one are probably not going to get through the screen, but a lot of these particles right here are probably going to get through there. So this sample, if you were to look at, if I were to assess this, my best guess is that this would be adequately processed. It probably wouldn't be over 70. It would probably be between like 60 and 65, someplace there, okay? But it is something that you can do on the farm because you need to have that assessment done immediately. Now, I will tell you some of the issues that we have with the corn silage processing score is that Randy's group has also shown, and I think some other groups have shown this as well, that processing score actually can be changed by material going through a bagger, just like particle size can be changed going through a bagger, especially if it's a Kelly Ryan or an ag bag that's got the teeth on it, right? So, you know, I have data from years ago showing samples coming out of a forage wagon and then putting it through a Penn State box and then going through an ag bagger, and then us going in and cutting a hole in the ag bag and taking a sample right after it was put in. You can lose almost 10, 12 points on the top of a Penn State box of particle size going through a bagger. And some of the data I've seen with processing, you can actually increase kernel processing score going through a bagger sometimes by about 5 to 7 points. The other thing that Randy has seen is that corn silage processing score appears to increase with time in the silo, and it can increase as much as similar 5 to 7 units. So that's something that you kind of need to keep in the back of your head as well. You know, when you're at 65 at harvest, again, you know, do you really need to be at 70 if you're at 65 at harvest? Maybe not if you're going to keep it in the silo for a few months, if the silo is going to get it to 70, okay? But nope, you know, I don't have the perfect answer, but there are some things that you can think about to help you make a judgment call. Of course, the shreddage machines that are out there now have a really great potential. In my mind, the two most important things with the shreddage machines are that, one, you can have more consistent, higher corn silage processing scores along with longer physically effective fiber in your sample. And it's the combination of those two things that I believe make the shreddage machines have their potential. It's the consistency of having samples at 65 to 70 CSPS scores with the long effective fiber together. So it's not just I'm getting one, I'm actually getting both of those things. Also, there's data. This is some of Randy's early data, and if you go on the web, you can probably find his most recent data where he's got some summary data from 50 or 60 or 70 farms now that show shreddlages with very high processing scores compared to kernel processing. But they also see some improvements in pack density. They also see some improvements in fiber digestibility. And I believe in both of the studies that Randy has run with lactating cow data, they have seen improvements in milk persistency in cows fed shreddlage versus normal KP kernel processed corn silage. Now, one of the things too that a lot of people have been doing recently is looking at fecal starches to help to assess what's happening within the diet relative to starch digestibility. And of course, this is some early work by Jimmy Ferguson at the University of Pennsylvania. Randy Shaver also has a more recent data set, but I'm going to show you Jimmy's here. And it basically shows that the relationship between fecal starch and apparent total tract digestibility of starch. So again, we would probably want to be up in this 98%, 97% total tract digestibility, which is basically corresponding to fecal starches down in the 1 to 2% range. And obviously, as your fecal starches increase, this means that your total tract digestibility is decreasing. And so typically what we are seeing here is that, based on at least Jimmy's data, is that for every 1% increase in fecal starch that you might get here, above a fecal starch of 4 to 5%, that potentially leads to a loss of about 0.72 pounds of milk for every unit increase above 4 or 5, okay? So that's a significant amount of milk that we potentially could be losing, because if you got starch in the feces, it's obviously not being digested, not being fermented or enzymatically digested and going to energy and milk for the cow. Recent work by Bremen and Kurtz, the Chris Hansen's group, sampling a whole bunch of different farms, looking at the relationships between now corn silage processing score, high and low, and then fecal starches in the blue here, okay? And what you can see is that there's this really nice inverse relationship that shows that if your kernel processing, okay, and then of course at the opposite end of the spectrum, as your kernel processing score declines, your fecal starches are increasing. And so the graph of that relationship is basically here in a simpler graph. Processing score high, fecal starches low. Processing score low, fecal starches very high, okay? And then the next thing that I'll kind of shift to then is talking about the fact that actually kernel vitreousness, or actually the prolamin proteins within the starch protein matrix itself, can also cause issues with starch digestibility. And this is some Wisconsin work showing vitreousness and availability of starch. And as our starch becomes more and more vitreous or more flinty and harder, our digestibility is declining, as you can see here. And it is the, once you get past the pericarp, and if everything then is equal from a particle size standpoint, the next thing that can cause differences in digestibility, even though those two other components are equal, is this protein starch matrix that has an effect on potential ruminal starch D. And very simplistically, flint corn, which is very vitreous and very hard, is less digestible than dent corn. That is less digestible than floury corn. And the relationship here, going from flint to floury, is that we have increasing vitreousness that's occurring. This actually should be the other way, sorry. This arrow here should be pointing the other way. So higher vitreousness here, low vitreousness there. Apologize for that mistake.
So, Limin, how much of difference do you see among commercial corn silage hybrids in vitreousness? Is that something that?
Yes, so that's a good question. So from what I can see, there's not that big of a difference in most of the commercial hybrids that are out there now, because we're mostly dent, but there are more and more people that are working on and have released in the last couple years more floury hybrids, trying to improve that starch digestibility. I know Francis Glenn, I don't know if you guys know that name, but Francis Glenn is the father of a lot of the corn silage hybrid lines in the US and Canada today. He's been working on a program working on floury endosperm and corn silage samples for several years now. And I know that you guys see this out there. There are companies already touting that we have high starch digestibility floury hybrids. So they're coming, but we still need more data on some of these hybrids. And this is what, if you want to look at, pictorially, what happens is that in this picture here, all of these big globules here are starch granules. And all of these little globules around here that look like they're making like a matrix or like a honeycomb beehive, these are all the prolamin proteins here. And as the number, amount, and complexity of these prolamin proteins become bigger and bigger and bigger and more complex, it starts to hinder access of starch by rumen bacteria and the cow's amylase enzymes. And these prolamin proteins are actually very hydrophobic. which means they don't like water. So they tend to repel water away. And when they repel water away, it makes it more difficult for rumen bacteria and enzymes to actually go in and actually have to attach to this granule to digest it. Because you have to remember that rumen bacteria don't have little mouths to eat these big globules. And in fact, a rumen bacteria would barely be visible in this picture if you were to try to find it, because it's so much smaller than what you see right here. And so they actually have to attach and grab onto these starch molecules. But if they're covered and surrounded by all of these poorly digestible proteins, it makes it more difficult for them to do that. Here's a vitreous endosperm that has a lot of protein matrix, and maybe it's not that clear to see, but you can see it. It certainly appears that the granules here are covered with more stuff here than here in the flowery endosperm, where it's a little cleaner around the granules, probably a little easier for these bugs to now attach. And of course, you know, the interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it is the different types of prolamine proteins that occur in different types of cereal seeds that actually are responsible for why different types of cereals seeds have different starch digestibilities. And so we know for a fact that barley starch is much more digestible in the rumen than corn. Corn is more digestible than sorghum. And the reason that there are these differences is because barley, corn, and sorghum have different types and amounts of prolamine proteins that then hinder the digestion. And so obviously what this tells you here is that that protein matrix with sorghum is much more complex than it is with barley, okay? Now, the next thing I want to quickly talk about is the reports that we all know of now. We've known this for many years now, that ruminose starch D in corn silages and high moisture corn appear to increase with time within the silo. And you can find high moisture corn going back as far as 1998 with some French work, and many studies recently with corn silage as well, showing that time in the silo actually improves digestibility. This is one of the first high moisture corn works coming out of Nebraska, looking at 24% moisture, high moisture corn, and 35% high moisture corn. In that study, they actually looked at in vitro dry matter, in situ dry matter digestibility. They didn't actually look at starch digestibility, but you know, high moisture corn is most of the dry matter that's going to disappear. I think you all agree is going to be starch. So it's still a good thing. What we saw here in this study is that the trend over time in the silo was always positive, whether it was 24% moisture or 35% moisture. So that's the first take home. Starch digestibility is increasing with time. But the second take home here is that starch digestibility increases at a bigger rate when there's more moisture versus when it's less moisture. And this is a function of maturity. As the plant matures, the reason that you saw those lines drop in that processing graph that I showed you from 30 to 45% dry matter, that's basically a maturity effect, because we're getting more and more prolamins laid down as the plant is becoming mature. And so the same thing happens in here. The drier corn, which is more mature, is going to have a greater prolamine matrix and is going to be harder to digest, but the improvement in digestibility is less than it was in material that was immature. Randy also has some data summarized from the commercial labs, looking at samples submitted from October through September through a year. And this is in vitro 6 or 7 hour starch digestibilities. And what you can see is the trend is over time, starch digestibility actually improves in that high moisture corn. So this is very similar to what I showed you in the first slide, but from a much bigger data set. And in his conclusion to this, Ferretto and Shaver basically say, in high moisture corn, some samples may take as much as 7 to 8 months before they reach maximum starch digestibility. This is some data from our lab several years ago looking at BMR corn silage and a normal corn silage hybrid. Again, the first thing I want to just show you is that there's this trend over time that the hybrids are improving in starch digestibility. Not sure whether this little dip here is real or not, but the big trend is here. If you look at this sample here, this is kind of an outlier sample that was kind of interesting. You can see that this sample started at time 0 with a very high in vitro starch digestibility estimate compared to this set of samples. And it increased, but it increased a smaller amount than these increased. And it also plateaued earlier than these did. And actually, if you take a look at that sample, even though it was 32% dry matter, was a kind of an odd sample from the field where it, instead of having about a 32% dry starch content like all of these samples had here, it for some reason had not matured and was, even though it was 32, but it was very low in starch. And so, but this is easily explainable then, because this is basically saying that this sample with 22% starch was immature. And so it did not have a very complex protein starch matrix to start with. Thus, its initial digestibility was quite high, and it plateaued out because it started out high, but couldn't go much higher than this ceiling of what I see in the field of about 80 to 85% in vitro starch digestibility at 6 or 7 hours seems to be about the ceiling for a lot of the samples that I see, not all, but a lot. Hoffman actually physically showed this, scanning electron micrographs of corn starch particles prior to ensiling, with a lot of more protein matrix here, and then with less protein matrix here. Maybe not that clear there. And of course, the reason that we have this improvement in starch digestibility in time is because there is a natural proteolytic process occurring within the silo that appears to occur for quite a long time depending on the sample. So what I'm showing here are the changes in soluble protein and ammonia nitrogen over time for the same 4 samples that I showed you, the starch Ds in the previous graph that was in color. And what you can see here is that over a year in the silo, we have some samples that are increasing in ammonia nitrogen and increasing still in soluble protein, albeit at a very smaller increase. You know, most of the change is occurring here. Okay, so we have some correlation markers then. If proteolysis is in fact the reason why we're getting these improvements in starch D over time, this is some data from our database, and Shaver and others have other huge databases that are much bigger than this. But as you can see, there is a positive relationship between soluble protein and starch D, and it's even though the R squared is not very high, it is highly significant here. In corn silage, the relationship between ammonia nitrogen and starch D is not as good as the soluble protein starch D is. But with high moisture corn, in a limited database that we have, it appears that both ammonia and soluble protein are predicting almost similar relationships with their increases and the increases in starch D. Now, of course, what this means for you as a producer or as a feeder is that if you're starting in September and you're harvesting and starch D in your harvested crop is 65 to 70%, but it increases over time, this is what you see. But now you're faced with the dilemma of what happens when you're out of that corn silage and you have to switch to new silage. And so this issue here, I think, is partially, not fully, but it is partially one of the reasons why sometimes you will hear complaints from producers about having what we call the fall slump, where they're basically switching from corn silage that is very, very hot in digestibility, and they're going basically cold turkey. Some of these, some of you guys may have to be, fill the silo today and feed out of it tomorrow. So there's no length of ensiling. And so you're potentially switching from here to here, and it sort of explains the reason why sometimes you may have that issue of cows really not milking to their full potential, in the fall. I mean, obviously that's confounded because these cows are coming off of the heat in the summer, so that's also a factor that could affect, poor production then. But certainly this could be another reason. And then usually what happens is that everybody's happy around February or March, right? And then, of course, on the other side of the ball game, what happens when we're in July or August is that now we've got heat stress. Now we have low milk fat test, and maybe it's because we've got cows that are fed silage that's actually too hot here, right? It's too fermentable here. So a couple of questions to ask as we move on here is assuming that access to cornstarch is not limiting. So let's assume that you can break the pericarp. Let's assume that you can process well enough. You can get your particle size to where you want. What options are there to improve ruminal starch D? And really, I think one of the big things is to try to control what happens at harvest and to not allow your corn to be overly mature when you harvest, realizing that there's a compromise there between starch percentage, total dry matter tonnage yield, and digestibility. But that certainly is something I think that is a big control point that we try to control. I'm going to show you just some experimental data on use of exogenous enzymes. I won't spend too much time on this, but I think you do need to see some of this data that is out there. This is some work from my lab where we worked with an amylase added to floury, dent, and flint corn and looked at the production of volatile fatty acids in vitro. And it is kind of what you would expect to see, that in general, the VFA production from floury corn, if you look at all of this in general, is in general higher than it is with the flint out here. And then, but when you add the enzyme has less of an effect here with the floury material because it's already highly digestible, versus the enzyme has a bigger effect. This was a lactating cow study that was done by us as well. Normal starch levels, about 25% starch, low amylase, high amylase. You can see we see a significant increase in milk production here, numerical increase here, but actually a little bit lower. Not sure why this drops at the higher level, but we've actually seen this phenomenon as well in fibrolytic type of enzymes too, where it seems that if you add too much fibrolytic enzyme, you actually cut back on milk production. And the theory in some of this high dose enzyme work would suggest that if you add too much enzyme, you may be actually blocking sites for bacteria to attach and for their enzymes to actually attach and then cause problems in the overall kinetics of what's happening within the silo. Other work out of Tanya Gressley's lab also in my department worked with normal starch, reduced starch with an amylase enzyme, and actually did not see any type of improvement in milk production when we use the enzyme in the reduced starch diet. And Shaver's group has also done several studies with the amylase type enzymes too. And I think we would all come to the same conclusion right now that, you know, there is some supportive data that would suggest that these exogenous enzymes from an amylase standpoint might work, but it's not consistent enough to date. And we're looking for some new formulations, some new data to better support the use of those types of enzymes. Then, are there ways to actually improve starch digestion in corn silage and high moisture corn quickly? Another common question I get asked, and the answer today is probably not. The future is probably yes, maybe in softer hybrids and in some other types of enzymes. And I'll show you some pretty interesting work that my group has done, but unfortunately it's not at a commercial level because of the cost. But I think it's important because it shows that there is a mechanism of how you can do this. We've just got to try to get the companies to give us something that's more economical. But the question becomes that, you know, if proteolysis is the natural thing that is occurring in the silo that is giving us improved ruminal starch digestion during ensiling, why not add a protease to enhance the process? So if you're an old-time silage guy, you're probably going to want to just throw your hands up and walk out the door because you're going, why do you want to add a protease to silage? Isn't proteolysis a problem in the silage making process? And the answer to that is actually yes. And obviously it's a bigger problem in alfalfa crops, but I don't think it's a huge problem in corn silage. And in corn silage, we're already low in soluble protein many times. And this process is a natural occurrence. So our group, took the stance, well, if this is a natural process that's occurring, can we do something to speed up the natural process? And the answer is yes. So we have worked with experimental proteases in high moisture corn and corn silage. And here's one example of soluble protein increasing over days in the silo for untreated silage. The same silage treated with a protease, ammonia nitrogen, treated with the protease. And then when you actually look at the starch digestibility over time, you see the protease treated actually improving starch D to a much greater extent than the untreated. And here's another study, 2 different enzymes, untreated corn silage, looking at starch D. There's a small increase over time, bigger increase, even bigger increase there. Now, again, all of this work is only experimental. There are some companies that are working on this, but the technology to actually make and purify these protease enzymes is very expensive today. So we're just hoping that the technology can improve so that we can get some of these products into the marketplace. Here's an interesting, anybody seen one of these? So this was on a farm that I was at a couple years ago in Maryland, and it was a custom job that he had built in conjunction with Lancaster Silos, and it's a post-processor. So this farm that I was on, basically the story that he had told me is that he could not get his custom guy to fix his corn silage processing score and process enough. And he felt that his corn silage processing score was quite low. I can't tell you what that number was, but it was not processed enough. So he had Lancaster Silos build him this post-processor where basically he could feed in material coming off of a wagon, and he was milking, I think, about 1,000 cows. And he said that he could post-process enough corn silage for his whole herd in about 30 to 35 minutes a day going through this unit. And it basically gave him about 5 pounds of milk. And so here's a gentleman that basically said, I can't fight the custom chopper here, but I know that my processing is not good enough, and I'm going to do something to try to rectify the situation. So it is kind of a interesting concept. That's, you know, a post facto thing. Not sure what this cost him to make, but I can't imagine that it was that much. But just something to think about. For those of you that are looking at high moisture corn, one of the things that is available to you is the feed grain evaluation system coming from UW-Madison, where you can put in a lot of different aspects of your corn, high moisture corn, and actually come up with ruminal starch digestibility, total starch indexes, fermentation rates, etc., that can be used in various models. So it is something that maybe you might want to talk with your nutritionist with, where you could actually take your sample, send it into the lab, and fill in all your data here and get some predictions on where you are relative to your high moisture corn and starch metabolism within your cows. So the scenario then that I'm going to leave you with is a couple things where you're saying, you know, I've got limited access to starchy feeds. What am I going to do? I don't either grow a lot of corn silage, or my corn silage is coming kind of late. One of the things then that you're going to have to deal with is possibly the use of highly traditional forages. And you're obviously going to have to really pay attention to quality and maturity, because this is what's driving fiber digestibility, right? So if you're not able to put in high energy starch feeds and you're going to have high fiber diets, the only way that you're going to maximize intake to support high levels of production is that those forages have to be highly digestible. They cannot be overly mature. They cannot be full bloom alfalfa. That's just not going to work, because you're going to have rumen fill problems. The other things that have been done in the literature is obviously a lot of people have done substitutions of starch with highly digestible byproduct feeds that are high fiber digestible byproduct feeds, things like soy hulls, etc. There's actually some work out of the University of Illinois that's a little dated right now, where they actually took the starch levels in the diets down to like 1 or 2% by replacing corn starch with highly fermentable soy hulls, and actually did not see a really big difference in milk production between those diets. But if you go back to those diets, the production was not really, really high in those diets. And so you kind of have to take that data with a grain of salt. I think it would be much different if you're talking about cows, over 100 pounds of milk. I think if you started to get much above, 5–10% soy hulls in the diet, you could start running into some issues. There's some work with that as well, showing that income over feed costs sometimes actually, if you put too much of these byproducts in, high fiber byproducts in, actually go lower. So you're actually stimulating cows to eat more, so your ration costs increase, so your income over feed costs actually goes down when you feed some of these high byproduct feeds, even though you're maintaining milk, or even maybe if you're increasing milk a little bit. So that becomes a problem. I think the other really important thing that you need to work with your nutritionists is to pay really close attention to the undigestible NDF indexes that are now available for us to use. That's a whole nother 10 hours of talk that you could have Rick Grant or somebody come to talk to you guys about. But in a nutshell, what people are trying to look at is the undigestible NDF fraction to try to make sure that we maximize intake potential from high quality forages and not stuff the rumen. And this is going to be really, really important as you start backing off of starchy feeds and are depending now more on these high fiber forages to take you to top levels of milk. And then the last thing is, what happens if you're in a scenario where you cannot ensile for a long period of time? You can't wait 7 or 8 months for this corn silage and high moisture corn to mature. Not a lot of good solutions here, just a few things. Obviously, you'd probably want to feed your less mature corn silage first, right? So if you had to feed that in the next week after it was harvested, if you had different fields or different bags that were segregated, I'd feed the stuff that was a little less mature first, keep all the more mature material and keep that in the silo to let Mother Nature do its proteolytic thing, improve the stability for that first. I would also definitely make sure that you have optimized your processing score at harvest. This is definitely something that you cannot afford to not test until 2 or 3 months later. This should be tested and optimized at the time of harvest so that you know your CSPS is where it needs to be. Same thing for high moisture corn and ground corn. And then of course, also look at the incorporation of sugar sources. I know sources are very expensive these days, but if you have the possibility of getting in some whey or whey permeate, some of this lactose, inexpensive sources of sugar to try to bring that into the ration and balance that in, that might help as well. So I've got a summary here. I went way over time. I apologize for that. Dan, any questions?
Thank you for your time, and we hope that you enjoyed the rest of your conference there.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much.